What would you do if you were strolling on a beautiful seaside promenade on a humid summer's evening, perhaps with your children, maybe your partner, when you saw from the corner of your eye a huge truck being driven onto an area reserved for pedestrians, knocking people down like ninepins? You'd wonder, as shock turned to panic, I think, whether this was an accident, a vehicle out of control. But then you'd notice, if you had long enough, that the lorry, for all its size still capable of touching 60 miles an hour and zigzagging from side to side, was being deliberately aimed at pedestrians like you and your loved ones. In my previous life as a foreign correspondent, I found it impossible not to consider these nightmare scenarios, for they were real, they happened, and I was sent to cover them. The one I'm talking about happened almost exactly a decade ago on the French Riviera. It left 86 people dead, at least a dozen of them were children, and more than 450 people injured, many of them with very serious crush injuries. The driver, a radical jihadist, was shot dead on the promenade, the English promenade as it's called, in Nice. This is how these attacks often end. Last weekend in Berlin, another Islamist drove a vehicle, just a van this time, into a crowd. The crowd was there for a pride march, before being gunned down by the local cops. For years it was my job to travel and report from such scenes of carnage. I remember individual Islamist atrocities distinctly: Nairobi, Islamabad, Istanbul, Sousse, Madrid, Paris and others. I now lose track. I had a vague sense that Germany had suffered a rapid succession of these awful attacks, so I looked to Reuters, the global news agency whose office in Berlin in the early 2000s I occasionally would work from, to check. Reuters, sure enough, had a list of attacks. It showed that before the incident in Berlin at the weekend, there had been another as recently as May, when 2 Germans were killed in Leipzig. In February, again, 2 dead when an Afghan drove into a crowd, this time in Munich, and so on. One attack on a Christmas market in 2024 left 6 dead. But what really struck me was the headline Reuters used: Major vehicle ramming incidents in Germany since 2016. It almost makes it sound as if these attacks were the work of the vehicles, not perpetrators armed with a vicious ideology, as if it was the cars that carried out these atrocities, not human wickedness. In my years at Sky News, on the scene at London Bridge or Westminster Bridge or Glasgow Airport, where vehicles were driven by Islamists with murderous intent here on British soil, I noticed these verbal acrobatics as they started to creep in. Attacks spoken of as if they were authorless crimes, which we had to learn to put up with, like freak weather events. But the clue to what's really been happening is also to be found in that Reuters headline: Major vehicle ramming incidents in Germany since 2016. Why might major ramming incidents have become noticeable after 2016? What was it a decade ago that changed? It was the year after Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel invited 1 million migrants to come to her country, most of them from the Middle East. It would be obtuse not to see a connection. But deliberately obtuse is where we are. Not just in Britain, but throughout the Western world. In Berlin, within hours of the attack on the Pride March last weekend, we saw how this plays out. Reporters on the ground were quick to assert that Berlin's gay community, first and foremost, felt threatened by right-wing forces, not the Islamism which had just crushed them under the wheels of a van. In Britain, a Labour MP posted this to her followers on LinkedIn. The incident in Berlin was, she said, part of a pattern of verbal attacks by supporters of Reform UK. That is quite a mental leap. Well, it's certainly mental, conflating an attack by an Islamist in Germany with the output of GB News while making no mention at all of what might have motivated a man called Abdul Balu to drive a car into a crowd of lesbian and gay Berliners. You might have thought that this apparent singling out of homosexuality by Islamists would worry some prominent openly gay leaders, but the Green Party leader Zach Polanski avoided any mention of Islamism when he sent all his love and solidarity to Berlin. As the writer Brendan O'Neill pointed out in his column this week, if the attack had been committed by neo-Nazi skinheads, Polanski would have been quick to point the finger and would have kept jabbing it for weeks. This is not to say right-wing terror isn't a thing. 2016 is also the 10th anniversary of the murder of the MP Jo Cox by a far-right extremist. I spent days in Batley, the constituency represented by Cox, after her killing. And then there was the fatal attack a year later when Darren Osborne drove a van into a crowd outside the Finsbury Park Mosque, killing a 51-year-old called Makram Ali. These two attacks in particular have allowed the mainstream media and some politicians to present terrorism in Britain as an equally prolific human universal. You listen to a government minister being interviewed about the threat posed by terrorists in our country, and you will be left with an impression of equivalence, not asymmetry. In reality, the perils posed by Islamism and right-wing terrorism are far from identical. In reality, 3/4 of MI5's caseload is made up of Islamist plots. More significantly, when it comes to the metric that really matters, namely how many British citizens are killed at the hands of their compatriots, it is Islamism which turns more plots into body bags. More than 90% of terror-related deaths in Britain in recent years have been the work of Islamists. I used to think this relativising was accidental, the product of well-meaning, if misguided officials who wanted to counter a growing public perception after 9/11 and 7/7 that Britain had an Islamism problem. Bureaucrats and journalists and policymakers who wanted to make sure that Muslims didn't feel victimised or stigmatised for the actions of a minority. If this meant playing up right-wing terror and playing down Islamist terror, then that was, I imagined they reasoned, a price worth paying. But honestly, I'm no longer sure it is entirely accidental. I want to read you a short extract from an official report, commissioned by the then government in 2023 and written by Sir William Shawcross, former chair of the Charity Commission, son of a one-time Labour MP. His report, it was an attempt to understand how successfully the Prevent de-radicalisation programme was working. And as part of that, he looked at how Islamist attacks, when they happened, were handled by the media, by NGOs and by government itself. And he concluded with these words: "The bereaved are emphasised, apparently spontaneous acts of unity are deliberately engineered, heroic migrants, sometimes fictional, are lionised. Instead of raising questions about migration policy, we must come together against the vaguely defined forces of hate." Who does this? Who emphasises the feelings of the bereaved and underemphasises the role played by perpetrators? Who is engineering apparently spontaneous acts of unity and inveighing against vaguely defined forces of hate? It seems pretty clear who Sir William had in mind. An organisation paid for by taxpayers, you in other words, working from the Home Office called the Research, Information and Communications Unit, the RICU for short. Earlier this summer, the Daily Mail sought to expose some of his activities, pointing out how it had been set up almost 20 years ago now by a former MI6 agent who was looking for ways of turning young Muslim men away from radical Islam. The Daily Mail made clear that over the years the work of the RICU had evolved, and increasingly it saw its job as a sort of agency of emollients, a soothing balm for an angry public, tamping down the temperature after an Islamist onslaught and pointing out that the forces of hate were drawn from all sections of society. Well, I've said before, including in one of these monologues, that I don't have a lot of time for conspiracy theories about the deep state. I've explained how when I was with the US Army during the invasion of Iraq, I saw how the Pentagon, far from cooking up a plot to mislead people about weapons of mass destruction, actually played an incredibly straight bat. They had an opportunity to claim WMD had been found and that the war to topple Saddam was therefore justified. But they didn't take that opportunity. So for me, conspiracy theories, no, not for me, not usually. But where this acronym, not WMD, but RICU, is concerned, I make an exception. In the latest edition of The Critic magazine, a Whitehall whistleblower makes a series of anonymous but entirely plausible claims about the work of the RICU. The unnamed author says that, for instance, when an Islamist drove a van into pedestrians in Westminster, groups linked to the RICU set about plastering the area with posters that bore slogans with hashtags like "Turn to Love" and #Love Will Win. In 2014, at the height of the Islamic State's reign of terror in Syria and Iraq, it's alleged that the RICU tried to reduce tensions after the beheading of aid worker Alan Hemming. The Sun, for instance, ran this front page, carrying the striking image of a Muslim woman wearing a Union flag headscarf and a headline, "United Against Islamic State." It's alleged the company responsible for that front page was a firm contracted by the RICU to produce digital campaigns with the aim of making them go viral. Many of the details about how the RICU operate are classified, and freedom of information requests are routinely denied. However, it's worth noting that Sir William Shawcross, in that 2023 report of his, said that the bar set for what constitutes dangerous Islamism by the RICU is relatively high, his words, while the bar set for what constitutes dangerous right-wing terror is correspondingly low. You may be thinking, even assuming this is true, whether it makes a jot of difference. The odd front page here, a few posters there. But where I think we should be casting a beady eye is where the work of the RICU may involve families left bereaved by Islamist terror. The anonymous author of the report into the RICU in last month's Critic magazine says guidance given to police family liaison officers, these are the people who grieving relatives deal with, allows the government to shape the public response to an atrocity. You can imagine how this happens. A family reeling from a completely unexpected and horrific event, they're unlikely to seek out attention themselves, so they'd be willing to let officers draft a response for the press. A response that might say, for instance, the family hope this latest attack will not stoke division, or something along those lines. The authorities can then insist that anyone who veers from this narrative of reconciliation is not respecting the family's wishes. Any of this sounding familiar, the respecting the family's wishes bit? When a man was allegedly attacked in Belfast by a Sudanese migrant a few weeks ago, the victim's family issued a statement. Here it is. It said, "We have many migrants in this country who make a deeply valuable contribution to our country, including in our healthcare system and hospitality sector, and we depend on them to make our country work. We do not want this terrible tragedy to be used to divide people and fuel hostility." I have no idea whether this conciliatory statement was the work of a grieving family or the work of others. Personally, if a close relative of mine had been attacked and nearly killed, I might be inclined to feel a little more Old Testament and a little less human resources about things. I don't know whether families are being encouraged to issue soothing statements like this, most probably not even written by them, but you'd have to say, on the balance of probabilities, it is certainly possible. And I think it's important, therefore, whether these statements are the work of the RICU or actually of big-hearted relatives who put community cohesion ahead of a pound of flesh, that we understand the trap that is being laid for us. Because anyone with eyes to see will have realised, at least when Starmer was still Prime Minister, that there is a willingness now to hide behind a family's wishes in order to close down dissent and neuter political troublemakers. So when Nigel Farage responded to the scandal over the death of Henry Novak recently, saying that white lives matter as much as black lives, Keir Starmer criticised the Reform leader for going against the wishes of Henry Novak's grieving family, who had requested that the student's death did not stoke divisions. This was, by the way, the same Prime Minister who'd been happy to stoke divisions when taking the knee for another man who died during a police arrest, namely George Floyd. It's incumbent on us, the public, not to be cowed by authorities who would rather they did the thinking about crime and terror and race relations rather than us. And to do this, we must prioritise reason over sentiment. What do I mean by that? Well, if you think about the political storm in the wake of the Henry Novak arrest scandal, this idea that a grieving family could veto public discussion about the crime is irrational. The case against Henry Novak's killer was brought by the Crown on behalf of everyone. It wasn't a private prosecution paid for by grieving relatives. Nobody wants to cause the Novak family, who have behaved with infinite dignity, additional anguish. But the trial against Henry's killer was brought for the public good. The issues it raises remain in the public domain, just as debate about the attack on Stephen Ogilvy in Belfast should, just as it's entirely legitimate to respond to a suicide bombing at a pop concert in Manchester with tough questions about religiously inspired terrorism rather than vague assertions about peace and love. I understand why the government wants to get ahead of public opinion after a terror attack, but it risks the forfeiture of its reputation as an honest broker. It creates an impression of a state so terrified of the emotions that might be stirred up, the criticism of mass migration that might follow, that it sees the manipulation of public opinion as part of its mission to protect the realm. I think we need to develop a keen ear for this officially administered bromide, this policing of anger. And in particular, we need to be on the lookout for double standards and ready to call it out when we see it. Take, for instance, the calls that follow an incident for the public not to indulge in wild conjecture. On one level, this makes sense. God knows I've sometimes jumped to conclusions based on first impressions that have proved to be wrong, and nobody wants to prejudice a future trial. But this reticence, this acceptance of the need to keep it zipped, it can't be two-tiered. And I'm afraid that's what it's become. So when this summer the Belfast attack happened and when Anne Widdecombe's death was announced, the public was urged not to speculate about motives. But the week after Anne's death, there was another incident. But for some reason this time, not everyone got the memo about avoiding wild speculation. The incident I'm talking about happened just outside Ipswich in Suffolk. A stately home had been rented for the weekend for an Islamic festival. But on the Sunday morning, the Muslim participants were told to evacuate. Keir Starmer, in one of his last tweets as Prime Minister, posted these words: "Shocking news that counter-terrorism police are investigating a serious, credible threat targeted at an Islamic event in Suffolk. Thanks to the quick action taken by police and the organisers, nobody was hurt. My message is clear. I will not tolerate any attacks on our Muslim communities or any form of anti-Muslim hatred." The former First Minister of Scotland, the reliably daft Humza Yousaf, claimed the incident could have been a terrorist attack of unimaginable scale. The Home Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, an impressive minister by many measures, went further still. She said that police should be thanked for a response that undoubtedly saved lives, adding that 12 individuals had been arrested and that this news would be deeply concerning for British Muslims. Just think about this for a second. Our Home Secretary, the person in charge of keeping us safe from terror, asserting that the police had undoubtedly saved lives. Except that her assertion turned out to be wrong, wildly wrong. The police hadn't saved any lives. The dozen men Mahmood talks about were all released without charge, except one who was charged with an unrelated offence. They seem to have been doing nothing more than flying a drone. It's very hard to escape the conclusion that our most powerful elected officials are very happy to speculate about what might have happened when there appears to have been an incident, if, that is, the incident involves Muslim victims, not so much when they are the perpetrators. Part of the problem here is that we've allowed the people we consent to police and protect us to embrace ideology. The only ideology they ought to embrace is the need to keep the public safe, equally safe. But now it's hard not to see evidence of ideological infiltration. This week, for instance, we learned that diversity and equality initiatives have cost the police, have cost us, therefore, more than £500 million since 2020. As the recent spate of Islamist attacks involving vehicles in Germany reminds us, there is a connection between increased mass migration and increased terrorist activity. Our political establishment would rather ignore this inconvenient equation, insisting instead that we ought to celebrate our diversity, no matter what the downsides might be. I think the British people have shown remarkable restraint in the face of repeated Islamist provocations, And just for the avoidance of doubt, and as a Christian who believes all men are my brothers and that we should turn the cheek where we can, I'm glad that we have. We have shrugged our shoulders as our urban landscape has been disfigured by the bollards and barriers needed to stop men driving cars or vans or lorries at us and our families. Anyone visiting the Houses of Parliament today will see what I mean. The seat of our democracy is literally surrounded by concrete blocks. But then so too are shopping arcades and sporting venues all over the country. God only knows what it's cost us. However, no amount of spending can stop everyone with a vehicle and a grudge. Last year, a British citizen who was born in Syria drove his car into a crowd of Jews outside a synagogue in Manchester. As the IRA used to say, you, the British police, need to be lucky every time. We, the terrorists, only need to be lucky once to get the headlines. Mention of the IRA will make some people point out that ultimately the men of violence can be parleyed with, can be persuaded to give up their bloodthirsty ambitions. Perhaps that's what the civil servants working for the RICU, the Home Office's shadowy Research, Information and Communications Unit, believe. With their posters and their encouragement of grieving relatives not to look back in anger, perhaps they think that Islamism is just another variation of Irish republicanism, and that if you can stop things boiling over, eventually all will be well. I sincerely hope they are right, but I suspect they are flat wrong. We in the West have a long track record of thinking we know what Islamists want, whilst knowing nothing of the kind. I remember being sent to Spain in 2003 to report on the aftermath of an horrific train bombing that left 191 dead. Everyone assumed it was a kind of punishment for Spanish support for the so-called war on terror. But when Al-Qaeda issued a statement, it concentrated on the duty of jihadists to reconquer once Muslim Andalusia, southern Spain. Radical Islamists are nihilistic. If they could get hold of a nuclear bomb, they would be inclined to use it in a way radical Irish Republicans never would. Pretending, as some did after last weekend's Berlin atrocity, that the real threat to life in Europe today is the far right, is to spectacularly, willfully, crassly miss the point. When a Labour MP sees pictures of a van driven by an Islamist into a Pride march and uses it as a stick with which to beat Reform UK and GB News, it's hard not to think of Winston Churchill's dictum that an appeaser is someone who feeds the crocodile, hoping it will eat him last. Bye for now. At Outpost, we are committed to free speech and shining a light on untold stories that matter. To support our documentaries, reports and podcasts, please like, share and subscribe to our work on Substack, YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Thank you.